Naila Suad Nasir is the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation. Her work focuses on issues of race, culture, learning, and identity. So I'm really honored, thrilled, the entire CASE team and NSF are just really pleased to have you here to talk to us today about cultivating learning identities in the context of social inequity and inequality. So thank you very much.
Oh, good afternoon. I hope that you all have been having a wonderful meeting. I've certainly been hearing great things. I am honored to be here to share a few thoughts this afternoon. And I thought a lot about what I wanted to share with you all. So it's a little bit of a potluck in terms of ideas. But the title of the talk is Cultivating Learning Identities in the Context of Social Inequality. And I feel like I have spent most of my career trying to figure out this connection between what happens for individual learners with respect to their learning and development in relation to the social context where learning, development, and life happen. So this is kind of another pass-through trying to think about how do we connect the kind of broader social terrain, what happens in schools and communities with what learners have and what learners need from the settings that we're designing and creating for them. So that's kind of the umbrella. So over the course of my comments today, I'm gonna take up these 3 questions, not super systematically and not in this order, but the questions I'll take up are how do we create and sustain learning environments that provide access to important and rigorous disciplinary content and which support learners in developing identities as learners. If you're familiar with my work, this piece about people developing identities and seeing themselves in connection with the learning settings they're operating in is really, really important. I think we've thought about that as a field as kind of outside of the process of learning. I think about it as actually fundamentally intertwined with the process of learning. And then what are some barriers for doing so equitably? And how do we overcome these barriers? And when I talk about barriers, I'm going to talk a little bit more about in-school settings, recognizing that you all are working in informal settings. And what I hope to come out of the lunchtime conversation is some mapping across those spaces. What does equity and inequity look like in settings outside of school? Because I think we have kind of assumed that out-of-school settings tend to be more equitable, and I actually think that's true. But they're not a panacea, right? So there is still work to be done, and I would like us to do some thinking together about what that work might look like. All right. So critical to understanding learning, whether we're talking about learning in school or learning out of school, is to first kind of note that when I say learning, I'm talking about a version of learning that's beyond just the cognitive. I think I've spent many, many years making that point along with many other people. But I wanted to kind of zero in a little bit that I'm talking about learning as fundamentally involving these 3 things. The development of identities, right, and there I'm talking about the kind of multiple senses of who one is in relation to the multiple communities people belong to and participate in, developed through mutual activity, so that for me this notion of identity isn't just something people carry with them, it's something spaces provide and allow people to develop in them. So learning spaces are really formative in terms of the kind of identities people develop. I'm also talking about interest, that sense of personal relevance, enthusiasm, cognitive engagement, that's connected kind of at best to values and meaning. So that without interest, actually, it's very difficult for learners to develop a sense of connection or identity. And without those 2 things, it's very difficult for learning to happen. And then finally, engagement. We're really thinking about the emotional, the affective, cognitive attention, and again, this sense of connection to an activity. And so learning for me is interwoven with those other 3 processes, and I think those who work in informal settings know this well, right? That's really important to connect all 3 of these processes, and when they are all present, learning happens in robust and rich ways, and when they are absent, you are torturing children. So I will leave it at that. I've also done some theorizing about the connections between identity and learning, right? And so I've been playing with this graphic. I think this is probably terrible, but what I'm trying to convey is that there's this kind of recursiveness to the connection between identity and learning, right? You come into a learning setting thinking about yourself as being connected to it or not, this being a thing that you do or a thing that other people do, And then you have the opportunity to learn some things, to gain some competence, to engage with the content. And as you do that, hopefully, your identity in that setting strengthens, right? And as that identity strengthens, you are more and more motivated and willing and engaged, and then you continue to learn more. Obviously, this circle has the reverse. See, I need any graphic artists in the audience. I need something that shows like the good cycle and then the bad cycle if that stuff is not there, but you get my point. And I think what's important there is both that identity and learning recursively co-create one another, but also that both are deeply connected to the contours, the social contours of the settings within which they occur. So you can't separate those processes from where they're happening, from who's in those spaces, and from the kind of processes of engagement. All right, so this is one of my favorite examples. I apologize if you've seen it before. And I forgot to load the video before I left California, so it doesn't have the terrible video that I normally play with this. But I spent a good number of years studying out-of-school settings, as Bronwyn mentioned. And one of my favorite examples, well, let me say a bit about that first. One of the reasons I studied out-of-school settings was because the very first study I did, which was my dissertation study, looked at learning in an out-of-school context and kind of showed that when you compared what students were learning outside of school and compared that to the same kind of content that they were learning in school, even if the content was the same, the learning looked really, really different. And so that led me to want to better understand, well, how are out-of-school settings creating spaces of learning that somehow seem to feel more natural for kids, that somehow seem to be spaces where learning happens unproblematically, when learning in school happens in such problematic ways for so many kids. So the study of track, and this student in particular, was really interesting for me because it was a setting where this coach took kids who may or may not have been interested in track. In fact, the athlete that is the kind of focal point in this example was a 14-year-old girl who was really into boys. Her mom decided this was not a good pastime and thought that perhaps she should run track because her brother ran track, so it would be convenient. She could, kind of make her do this. It would be one pickup after school instead of two. And this was going to be, so she was slightly resistant to this idea of how she would spend her time. But the coach also saw something in her, and the interesting thing about out-of-school spaces that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is that you're not just a track athlete, right? You're a hurdler, or you're a shot putter, or you're a sprinter. So you take up a specialized role that comes with a whole set of identities and skills in this broader space. So the coach had decided, this student, her name was Olivia, that Olivia was going to be a hurdler. Olivia did not agree that this was what she was destined for. And so this moment of teaching and learning happens as this group of girls is learning to three-step. So if you've ever run track, three-stepping is when you take 3 and only 3 steps between each hurdle. And I will say I've never run hurdles because I am about as unathletic as they come, but it looks really difficult. And those things are like really high. So Olivia's like, okay, we're gonna do this. And she's at the front of the line. This is the kind of, the transcript there is what happens afterwards. So she makes it over those first few hurdles and then knocks down a hurdle 4 hurdles down. When a hurdle falls on the track field, it is really loud. It is quite embarrassing. Everybody stops what they're doing and turns around to see what catastrophe has happened. So she's clearly publicly failed this task of clearing all the hurdles and learning to three-step. So she finishes, she comes back to where the coach is, and this is the interaction that ensues. And for me, this interaction is kind of like the epitome of what it looks like to do learning and identity work in a learning moment, right? So she comes back to the front of the line, and she says to the coach, I can't get it. And the coach says, look here, kid, I can't, look here. You're going to be a hurdler. That was the best that you've ever gone over any hurdle. That was the best you've ever gone over any hurdle. Did you feel how much speed you had when you came off? But you have to control that speed. And when you get to the next hurdle, 1, 2, 3, up, over. And he does this little demonstration. And she says, how many did I have? 4? Meaning how many steps between each hurdle? Because remember, they're learning to three-step. Yeah, 4. You had 4. That's why it went over. And so what I think is fascinating about this interaction is that the first thing he says isn't, you're going to learn to do this. The first thing that he says is, you are going to be a hurdler, right? So he assigns an identity of competence to her in this space, even in the face of what has been a very public failure, right? And then he reframes the task. It's not about the fact that the hurdle went over. It's about the fact that the way you went over that hurdle you did clear was really technically very good. And like, that's what we're going for. So there's this reframing exercise of what competence looks like. And then he engages her in thinking about how to move forward. So next time, right, there's gonna be a next time. This isn't a one-time performance where you fail. It's multiple opportunities. He engages her in this analysis of why the hurdle fell over. How many did I have? 4? Yeah. And then she's like, oh, okay. And the tone he uses there, which I didn't have a chance to show you, but he says, yeah, you had 4. That's why it went over. In other words, the fact that the hurdle went over isn't the thing to focus on. And so it's this moment of reframing and offering an identity as a learner, even in a space where someone has failed. And I always have in the back of my head when I talk about this example, school as kind of a contrast. Like, what happens when you fail a thing in some classrooms looks very, very different than this. So all of that to say that I think this, for me, offers a great example of what it is that we are shooting for in how we're organizing learning settings to provide moments like this. And maybe one other thing I will say about it, the feedback happens in the moment with an opportunity to try it again. So how is it then, if settings like track or settings like the out-of-school environments that you all are creating, designing, and studying, if those environments support and offer identities to young people, how does that happen? So this is some work, some theorizing about that. I have argued that, again, what's important to understand about identity is partially that people carry some core identities with them wherever they go, right? But what's probably, for me, more important to understand is the parts of that that change and develop through our engagement in the world. So if that's true, if participation in activities changes who we think we are and who we can be, how does that change happen? So I argue that it happens in 3 ways. There are 3 ways that environments offer resources for people to build identities with, right? There are the material resources, like the stuff in the physical environment, the artifacts, the people, well, no, actually the material is just the physical, the organization. So for instance, if you take track as the example, track athletes know they're track athletes because they're wearing uniforms. They're on a track. They have cleats with those spiky things at the bottom, right? There are lots of things in the space that let them know who they are, right? There's also the relational resources, the relationships with others in the setting. One of the things that became really important for Olivia over the course of the season is she built really deep bonds with her track athlete teammates. And those bonds bounded her to them, but also to this learning space and the activities that they did there, as well as the relationships with coaches and other adults in the setting. And then the third is what I have called ideational resources. So these are ideas about who you are, what is valued in a setting, and that learning settings offer ideas for you by which you can remake or make yourself differently. So I think a lot about these as processes that are deeply tied to learning, but also about who has access to which of them when, right? Because what we know is that all children are not evenly offered resources to build learner identities with in every setting. And I think it's something we have to take very, very seriously. I will say, before I talk a little bit more about the equity challenges in supporting learning, is that I do think informal settings are uniquely designed to do this work around learning and identity in robust ways. And I mentioned a couple of the studies that I've done in this area, but this kind of just summarizes some of the findings across studies, which are that in informal settings, learning is part of what you do, but it's not the goal of what you do, right? You're doing what you do and you learn along the way to get there, which is actually a much more kind of natural process for us. So for instance, you see there in the corner that picture of the children playing dominoes. Kids learn when they're playing dominoes, but the goal is to win, right? The other thing that's kind of effective about this learning and identity work that happens in out-of-school settings is that people often have defined roles, right? So I talked about Olivia as not just a track athlete, but as a hurdler. That was true in the domino setting, that was true in basketball settings that I've studied, which is people tend to take up either formal or informal roles that are their specialized roles in the space. And those roles become really important to them developing identities as learners in those spaces. There's also a tremendous amount of social interaction and support for learners, and the assumption of competence, which I think is super important, that out-of-school settings tend to already assume that you will be able to do this work, that you will be able to learn whatever it is you need to learn to be competent in this space. And they provide access to moments for authentic involvement and accountability. In other words, you have an authentic set of responsibilities. You're not practicing for some other authentic task later. And finally, informal learning settings tend to offer more opportunities for people to bring some of themselves to the space. So when I studied basketball players, for instance, they said things like, I would say, like, what's your role on the team? And sometimes they would say things like, well, you know, I'm the point guard, and so that means I have these responsibilities. And then they would say, but I'm also the person that motivates everybody else, because I'm a very upbeat person, and so I come in and I tell people it's okay, we're gonna win. And that opportunity to bring who you are to a setting and have that who you are valued is critically, critically important. So I'm gonna shift gears now. Now that so that was kind of the micro about what it looks like when settings effectively support learning and the connection between learning and identity, to think about what is the world in which we're trying to do this work, and what is kind of the national moment within which we're trying to do this work. And this is, again, this pondering I'm trying to do between the big picture and the small picture, so bear with me. So we are in this, I had to put up we're in Virginia, I had to, I know, forgive me. I just thought that was just such a funny moment. We're in this national moment where equity concerns are pressing, right? Levels of inequality are rising in astronomical ways. Wealth inequality, educational inequality, inequality on all dimensions are at really unprecedented levels. We're in a moment where there are decreases in funding for public education, and where there's this prevalence of divisive, racialized discourse that children and communities and families and teachers and the spaces that we're working in are bombarded with every single day. I won't say too much more about that graph. That graph shows the rise in wealth inequality, which I just find it so fascinating that this top 1% is gaining so much traction so quickly, and it's changing the contours of our society, and it's changing the environment within which the families and communities we work in, changing the terms of what it means to be an American, actually. Anyway, and our time is characterized by actually really severe equity challenges. So they're widening access gaps in all realms, whether you're talking about healthcare or wealth or educational opportunity, which means the effects of poverty are less likely to be buffered in the families and communities where we're working. Higher education is much less accessible due to rising costs, wider preparation gaps by social class and race. I think that graph there shows changes in college tuition. And, you know, and kind of not for nothing, the Pell grants haven't increased in 30 to 50 years. So these are real costs being borne by families, and the lack of access to higher education then makes the long-term impacts of poverty more severe. We're operating in a time of fewer social safety nets, fractured pension systems, where the achievement of education and educational access is both more elusive and more important than ever. And I do think, to some degree, like, I know there was like an abrupt shift into this topic, but I think it's so important to think about, why do these things matter for the places where we're trying to support people in their learning? Because so often we create a boundary around the space that we're working in that says, those big things that are happening in the world, those are out there. Right now, what I can deal with are these kids sitting in front of me in this space and designing something important for them. And I do think that's important, but I think we also have to both theorize and pragmatically deal with the conditions that our nation is creating for families and communities. So this is kind of my effort to start to do the weaving together there. So there is, of course, a huge conversation about inequality in STEM generally. We've talked about this historically as achievement gaps, where we ask the question, why are those poor and brown people doing less well than others? We have kind of evolved over time to talk about those achievement gaps in different kinds of ways. One is to talk about them as opportunity gaps, which is to say, achievement gaps occludes the fact that people are not wired differently. They encounter different kinds of opportunities in order to develop their potential and engage. So many have moved to talking about opportunity gaps because opportunity gaps also allow us to address what the problem is, right? Which isn't something rooted in families and children, it's something rooted in the types of environments we provide for them. Gloria Latza-Billings has talked about inequality as an education debt to actually highlight the ways that the differences in the types of educational access that we offer along racial and social class lines aren't accidental, they're rooted in a history of oppression and exploitation. And I think I have begun to think about these as opportunity hoarding. Like, what happens when you shift the lens from the folks who are being exploited to the folks that are doing the exploiting? And when I say folks, I don't mean individual people, obviously. I'm talking about the way that our society is structured. And I all last year, every talk I gave started with this same story that I'll give you a shortened version of, because I was just so fascinated with the way that this story gives us insight into the kind of long-term effects and processes that make up structural inequality. So about a year and a half ago, I read this story in the New York Times that was about the Jack Daniel's whiskey company. And did anybody see this story? Yeah. Okay, so super entertaining. Jack Daniel's, they're like redoing their visitor center, and somebody finds a box in the back as they're doing this, redoing the visitor center. And they had been telling this story, like Jack Daniel's came and they had this wonderful recipe for whiskey and developed this country and sold the whiskey and people bought it, and it's like this great, like, American dream story. But in these materials they found, it turned out that actually the person whose recipe, who had the recipe for whiskey, was not actually Jack Daniel's. It was a slave that the Jack Daniel's family owned, right? Whose descendants then went on to work for the company, to continue to, make the whiskey, make sure all the machines were working right. And so you have these descendants of the slave of Jack Daniel's who built this thing that didn't have any opportunity to partake in the wealth that was built from it. And the Jack Daniel's family that through this structural system of exploitation that they did not create, but they engaged in, built this wealth. And for me, that is the definition of opportunity hoarding and the way that that then carries forward. So as we think about, again, this broader, what is the broader world in which we are thinking about and creating settings for learning? It's why I say we can't leave that broader world out of the picture, because families and communities and children are experiencing the fallout from these long-term historical processes of inequality. Okay. I sometimes too tell a story there about doing my family tree, but I'll spare you that in the interest of time. Okay. So inequality plays out in learning settings in two really key ways. One, through providing or not providing access to resources and the structures of learning, so super material things as well as the kind of symbolic things, and in the presence of negative stereotypes. And here I'm talking primarily about racial stereotypes. You could also talk about gender stereotypes, stereotypes about disability, stereotypes about sexuality, there's a full range of things. But I write and think a lot about racial stereotypes and the impact of racial stereotypes on children in learning settings. I won't say too much more about that, but just to say, maybe to state the obvious, that that children are faced with a myriad of negative racial stereotypes that they have to navigate every single day. I think here about the children in studies that I've conducted, also about my own children. I have a 14-year-old son who is all of a sudden like taller than me, which he is very much enjoying. Me, not so much. But so he's in this space where he's just moved from having a little boy's body to a man's body, and a black man's body at that. And one day he was, his dad and I are divorced, but his dad had come by and maybe hung out for dinner or something, and he brought this carton of ice cream because he likes his special things. And his dad had left this ice cream in my freezer and realized it halfway home, and he's like, hey, I left my ice cream, I'm coming back for it. So my son, being the lovely, warm-hearted child that he is, he was probably 12 at this time, takes the ice cream and goes and stands out on the corner. Now, we live in a tremendously middle-class neighborhood, and my goofy son is standing on the corner at just after dusk with this carton of ice cream. And before his dad is able to make it back to get the ice cream, a neighbor, who we don't know, a man out walking his dog, says to my son, what are you doing here? And he's like, he's a kid, right? He's like, well, I'm a goofy kid, look, I live right there, And the guy's like, well, I've never seen you in this neighborhood before. Are you sure you belong here? And my son is like, at some level he knew it felt hostile, but he didn't know how to make sense of that hostility, right? So he comes back in the house and he's like, there's this weird guy out there who's asking me, like, do I live here? And so my ex-husband comes, picks up the ice cream, and we tell him the story of what's happened. This is why sometimes you have to appreciate your ex-husband, because he gets back in the car and finds the guy. And he says, hey, that was my son that you talked to, and you have no reason to speak to him, and even less reason to believe he does not belong here. And the guy says, look, I was just protecting the neighborhood. And he thought that this was a legitimate, and so in all of this, I'm trying to figure out, what to say to my child, who is still very much a child, so that he understands how the world is seeing him. Oh, and the guy also said he was flailing his arms in a very odd way. I was like, he was holding ice cream. How could he have been flailing? Anyway, but this conversation about how he was being seen in relation to a stereotype about what it means to be in a black man's body in this world, whether you're in your own neighborhood or not, was a conversation I had to figure out how to have with him, and how to have it in a way where you make him aware enough not to be on a street corner obliviously holding ice cream because something could happen to him on that street corner in our neighborhood, but to give him some tools to manage that, to understand that you will be stereotyped this way and still you're okay, and still you're fully human, and still you're valuable, and still, all of that work. And so I guess my point here is that for me it brought home the stuff that I study, which is to say because I think as adults, we sometimes forget the ways that young people have to manage how they're being seen by the world. And as people of relative privilege, we forget how people who don't hold privilege have to manage how they're seen in the world every day. And so that's what I mean by the presence of negative stereotypes, not just in this abstract way, but in this very real way of what it means you have to manage. And I think those things play out in schools in very strong ways, as we know, but also in out-of-school environments as well. Okay. So as we think about designing settings of learning in equitable ways, I think about 3 dimensions of what I would call kind of under the banner of equitable ways, right? One is equity. Equity I define as the guarantee of access, opportunity, and advancement for all, despite identified or invisible barriers which prevent full participation. So equity is about, is the playing field even, right? Does everybody get the same opportunities based on where they start from? And not equality, equity, right? The second is inclusion, which is the practice of creating welcoming environments in which any individual or group experiences respect, support, and value. So inclusion is about what the space feels like to be in for everyone who shows up there. And then there's diversity, which is, we talk about that, I think, a lot as a society, which is the presence and representation of ethnic, gender, racial, socioeconomic, any other kind of distinct group with identifying characteristics. I say on campus because I often use this slide to talk about higher ed. But I think my point for you all, and for the work that we all do here, is that when you're thinking about creating equitable learning environments, you want to think about all three of these dimensions. Is the space diverse? Who has been invited in and who has not been invited in? Or who has self-selected in and who has not self-selected in? That'll tell you something about the space that you're creating. What does it feel like for people to be there? And what are the ways opportunity is being afforded or not to everyone who shows up in the space? Okay, I'll leave it there. As we know, schools have lots of challenges with all three of these things, and they're systemic, deeply troubling, long-standing challenges: segregated schools and neighborhoods, vastly unequal funding levels, tracking practices that happen inside schools, the prevalence of othering, what John Powell calls othering, in less diverse settings, and an overwhelmingly white and female teaching force, which impacts not just how teaching and learning are organized and who has access to what, but also whose knowledge gets counted as legitimate. I put that last part in there for Megan Bang, who wasn't able to join us today, if you know her work. That was my nod to Megan. So what does equity-centered teaching and learning look like? It looks like spaces where access to structures, right, is not dependent on family resources, and that structures actually work to broaden access, not narrow it. And this is an active thing I'm talking about. Like, how do you create structures that bring people in? Processes. How do you have processes that invite people in rather than exclude? And access to relationships and spaces where you provide opportunities for genuine connection between adults and young people and among peers. Those, for me, are the dimensions of what equity-centered teaching and learning looks like. And I think it's critically important in any learning setting that we are designing to be intentional about equity, because if we are not intentional, the default is the lack of equity, inequity, and possibly worse. So the intentionality is really, really critical, even when the ways that inequity play out are not visible to you. Because often as we're the adults or the organizers in the setting, the ways that other people are experiencing these settings inequitably won't be visible to us, and people will not tell us unless we ask. Right? That's how power works. I have a story about that too, but again, I'm running short on time. I wanted to, before I end, give you a couple of examples of what equitable instruction looks like, recognizing that these are both in-school examples, and again, hopefully we can think a little bit more about what this might mean for out of school as we move into lunchtime. Fully aware I'm standing between you and lunch. So these data come from a study that I did on a school in California, affectionately known in the research literature as Railside. It actually doesn't exist in this form anymore, which is a whole other thing. But at the time, Railside is an urban comprehensive high school with a tremendously multiracial student population, like 54% Latino, 21% Black, 17% Asian, 30% of the kids qualified for free and reduced lunch, 25% were English language learners. And importantly, Railside decided somewhere in the late 80s that they were going to create an equitable mathematics teaching and learning experience for all students that came in the doors. And one of the first things they did was to detrack the mathematics classrooms and to build on and co-create this multi-ability curriculum that said everyone comes in the door with strengths, we will build on those strengths. Everyone comes in the door with weaknesses, we will support people in moving beyond their weaknesses. And they had this tremendously strong record of success, which Joe Bowler and Megan Staples reported in a comparative study across school contexts, that at Railside, race and gender gaps were eliminated for students by their senior year. So if you came in as a freshman, by the time you graduated as a senior, there was a pretty complete elimination of racial and gender gaps, which is quite extraordinary. So how did they do this? We wrote about it. That's the book. But I'll just highlight a few things. And this book was really fascinating to do because we brought together all of the co-authors, save Nicole, who was a graduate student at the time, is now on faculty at Wisconsin. we brought together this group of teachers as the department was kind of imploding. Again, another story for another time. And they had created this thing that was working really well, but they had not had time to sit and think about what it was they had done. So this book was kind of the product of the teachers, with our support, space, lunch, computers, to help think about what they had done. And here's what they came up with. That they operated from a set of underlying assumptions, which were that all teachers and all students are learners. So there's this attempts to equalize power, right? That they work from strengths but made space for vulnerability. That vulnerability piece is really important because I maintain you cannot learn in a space where you cannot be vulnerable. Not knowing sometimes makes you feel really vulnerable. Redefining what it meant to be smart. So taking the notion of smart as being you solve all the problems, right, and you do it quickly, to you engage authentically, you support your peers in collaborative problem solving, you ask good questions, really broadening that definition of smart, which let other people in who didn't have that other narrow skill set well developed. Redefining what it means to do math in school, from you sit at your desk and solve problems to you work with your student colleagues to engage really interesting high-level tasks. And they highlighted the importance of relationships. This piece about relationships for me just keeps popping up and threading through, right? They also did some stuff, right? They maintain a really strong commitment to equity. They rescheduled all the courses to have block scheduling, which is one of those structural pieces. I think it's such a beautiful example of that. So the block scheduling meant that they had two things. One, courses that used to be a year long were semester long, and they were in 2-hour blocks each day. That allowed for kids to be able to fail a course, retake it, and still be on track to take calculus. Like, it's one of those things that had this huge impact in a way that I think is super powerful. They engaged these models of complex instruction and group work, and they had this highly developed teacher professional community. This is a community that Judith Warren Little has written about quite a bit. All of these collective practices around creating and maintaining community. And they did lots of stuff around group work. Keep it moving here. And then the final example I wanted to share with you is from a more recent study around a district-wide initiative focused on Black male students in Oakland, California. It was the first of its kind nationally. Out of this district-sponsored initiative that came about because there's a new superintendent who was looking at the data and said, we are failing Black male students, and we have to stop doing that. And the initiative was the effort to say, how will we address this? With the assumption that if we address this for Black male students, we will support better learning throughout the district, right? So the kind of rising tides lifts all boats notion. Anyway, they developed this program, provided these all Black, all male classes in the high schools and in some of the middle schools, and created this really very special space. We just wrote a book about it. It just came out in late December. And I'm not gonna go into a super amount of detail, but just to say that the teaching philosophy of this space was rooted in, and this is as articulated by the instructors, humanization and love. And I know that we don't much talk about love in educational spaces, but this is the way these instructors saw their work, as being about creating spaces, and if you think back about the story with my son, right? Creating spaces where these Black boys could come into a room and be treated with value and respect, and as if they really, really matter. And they saw that as almost like this inoculation from what the kids were experiencing the rest of the day, which involved harsh disciplinary practices, coming into an honors class and it being assumed that they're in the wrong room, like all manner of kind of microaggressions throughout the day. This was the space they felt like they could provide that would help kids be able to manage these other spaces, right? And they did lots of stuff there. They did a lot of explicit work around understanding, debunking, reframing stereotypes about Black males. They had a whole new set of discipline practices where a lot of things that in other classrooms would be deemed as unacceptable were like totally fine. My best example of that is it's the first day of class, brand new instructor who's fresh out of college, and he starts telling the kids, this is what this class is about and this is what we're gonna do, and a kid in the back starts beating on the desk. Like, I can't do it to a rhythm, but he was beating on the desk to a rhythm. And the instructor looks up and you're like, oh, okay, what's gonna happen? Like, here's this moment of like showdown. And the instructor says, Keep that beat going. And he starts talking to the beat that the kid is keeping on the back of the desk. And after a while, of course, the kid gets tired, and he stops, and the instructor's like, what happened to the beat? So it's taking this thing that was actually probably intended as a challenge, as an affront, and making it like, this is fine here. It's okay. Like, you can be who you are here. And then this other piece about relationships. They spent lots of time and energy building relationships. The instructors allowed themselves moments of vulnerability to talk about something that might be upsetting them, a breakup, or something happening with their kids. And they created this space that was deeply rooted in community and trust. So to sum up, I was trying to think about what would be useful to sum up for you all in particular. And I think thinking about what it means to create learning spaces in equitable ways means, one, the willingness to engage in self-awareness and be reflective, right? Like, not to engage the spaces by saying, we know how to do this, we've done this already, but rather, what can we learn about how we can do this better? There's always that space. It's kind of like, parenting in that way. You can always be better. And you're always going to fail to some degree, but that's, again, another story for another time. Maintaining a commitment to equity and doing the work to get there. So I think this is on the note of, for equity to occur in this society that is so vastly steeped in inequity, it has to be intentional, and we have to do intentional work in the spaces where we are working. Engaging communities in deep and collaborative ways, remembering to keep on the table a really complex understanding of learning, that it's more than just test scores and cognitive shifts. I'm sure that's like, you all are already doing that, of course. And a complex understanding of identity. And I didn't talk too much about this, but I think it's really important when we're talking about identity not to say, these kind of kids think about themselves in this kind of way and they're all having the same experience, because it actually really varies depending on family context and kind of social location. And then thinking about multiple dimensions of equity that might be at play in any learning setting. Race, gender, disability status, sexual orientation, all of these things are playing out in multiple kinds of ways. And again, just structure, process, relationships all need to go together to move towards creating equity. And I will stop there and see what you have to say.